Marie Antoinette is best known today for her execution during the French Revolution, and ever since she has become synonymous with class divide, royal extravagance, and indifference to France's poverty. Less well known is the story of her children and family. Join me as we explore what happened to them. While it is well known that King Louis XVI and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, were deposed and executed in the early 1790s as part of the French Revolution, what is often less noted is the residual role which the House of Bourbon, the French royal family from which Louis hailed, continued to play in French politics during the 19th century. Indeed, one of Louis and Marie's children even went on to briefly become the Queen of France herself in 1830. Marie-Thérèse Charlotte was the eldest of Louis and Marie's children. She was born on the 19th of December 1778 at the Royal Palace of Versailles outside Paris. She acquired 3 siblings in the years that followed, yet each would live tragically short lives. Louis Joseph was born in 1781, but died of tuberculosis in 1789, when he was just 7 years old. The same disease had already killed Marie's only sister, Sophie Helena, in 1787, when she was just shy of her first birthday. The final sibling, Louis Charles, was born in 1785, and as we will see, was to play a role in the tumultuous events which led from the French Revolution of 1789. Marie's childhood was spent surrounded by the pageantry and formality of the royal court at Versailles. She was reared by a series of governesses, which included her mother's closest confidant, Yolande de Polastron, Duchess of Polignac. Contrary to popular perceptions, her mother, Marie Antoinette, was not some airheaded spendthrift who was indifferent to the well-being of France's citizens, but attempted to encourage in her daughter the virtues of charity. Nevertheless, trouble was brewing throughout France, and in particular, amongst the swelling population of Paris. A series of harvest failures and economic crisis throughout the country in the 1780s had destabilized France considerably, and it would soon all boil over. In 1789, in an effort to allay the financial crisis, Louis XVI agreed to convene a meeting of the Estates General, the French Parliament. This had not met in over a century and a half, but was now needed in order to vote a large financial payment to the monarch, with which the imminent economic collapse of the French state could be averted. Louis, for his part, believed he could grant some small concessions to the Parliament, following which he would disband it and return to ruling autocratically from Versailles. He was profoundly mistaken in this assumption. In the summer of 1789, after the Estates met for the first time, the king and his ministers quickly lost control of the situation. The Parliament soon began assuming political power into its own hands and moved the seat of government back to Paris itself. The storming of the Bastille prison in the city on the 14th of July 1789 by a Parisian mob was a climactic moment in the French Revolution, indicating the extent to which Louis had become marginalized in the governance of his own country. Members of the royal court now began to flee from France. Then, in early October, a large band of Parisian citizens showed up at Versailles and forced the king and queen and their 2 living children to relocate to Paris. They would spend the next year and a half residing at the Tuileries Palace in the French capital, before an ill-judged attempt to flee from France in June 1791 was botched, leading to a souring of relations between the king and queen and the revolutionary government. Eventually, in August 1792, Louis was deposed, following which he was put on trial and executed by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. Marie's mother soon met with a similar fate in October 1793. Thus, by the end of 1793, Marie-Thérèse was effectively an orphan, under arrest in Paris by a hostile revolutionary government. Both her and her younger brother, Louis Charles, remained under arrest in separate locations. Eventually, Louis died on the 8th of June 1795. This, as with his and Marie's deceased brother and sister, was also almost certainly owing to tuberculosis, but an autopsy conducted in the days after his death revealed signs of physical injuries, and the boy, just 10 years old when he died, had evidently been mistreated in captivity. Louis Charles passed away just as the most violent and extreme period of the French Revolution was coming to an end. A more sanguine administration eventually granted Marie-Thérèse permission to leave France in December 1795, right before her 17th birthday. She would now head for Vienna to live in exile at the court of her Austrian cousins, while her mother, Marie Antoinette, had been born into the Austrian royal family of the Habsburgs. Marie arrived in Vienna in the first days of 1796. She was the only member of the Bourbon royal family to survive a prolonged period of arrest by the French revolutionary government in the first half of the 1790s. Shortly afterwards, she was relocated to Courland in modern-day Latvia, where her uncle, Louis XVI's brother, Louis Stanislas, had taken up residence, proclaiming himself as King Louis XVIII of France. The self-proclaimed king wished for Marie to marry Louis Antoine, the son of Charles Philippe, another of Louis XVI's brothers. Despite them being first cousins, Marie agreed to the union, and the couple were married on the 10th of June 1799 at the Jelgava Palace in Latvia. Marie and Louis Antoine subsequently relocated to Britain. Here, they could well have lived a long life in comfortable exile, but eventually, events back home in France were to radically change the course of Marie's life yet again. In the late 1790s, the French Republic had gradually mutated into a military dictatorship, headed by General Napoleon Bonaparte. Eventually, in 1803, this Corsican military commander proclaimed himself Emperor of France. Years of war followed, during which Napoleon first conquered most of Europe, and then lost it all, having made the mistake of trying to invade Russia. When he was forced to abdicate for the first time in 1814, it was the signal for the Bourbons to return to their homeland. Marie's uncle, Louis XVIII, now resumed the monarchy of France, and despite a brief return to power by Napoleon in 1815, the Bourbon restoration would prove enduring. He would rule the country of his ancestors until 1824. When Louis XVIII died on the 16th of September 1824, he was succeeded by his brother Charles Philippe, who would become King Charles X of France. As a brother of Louis XVI, the new monarch was simultaneously Marie's uncle and her father-in-law. His eldest son was Marie's husband, Louis Antoine. As such, 30 years after her parents had been executed at the height of the French Revolution, Marie now found herself married to the heir apparent to the French throne. The new monarch Charles X was deeply unpopular in the second half of the 1820s. A staunch royalist, he alienated a broad cross-section of French society through his efforts to re-establish a strong French aristocracy and his support for the Roman Catholic Church, all measures which reminded the French people too much of the absolutist rule of his older brother in the 20 years or so prior to the Revolution of 1789. Charles fought back against his opposition, initiating a colonial war in Algeria in order to build support for his rule at home, but eventually he went too far in his absolutist tendencies. The spark which led to his deposition was due to the issuing of a series of laws in July 1830. The July Ordinances, as they have been termed, dissolved the French Parliament, limited voting rights in the country, and attempted to censor the press. Within days, widespread riots against his rule spread throughout France. This has become known as the July Revolution of 1830 and led to Marie's brief stint as Queen of France. Realizing that his situation was hopeless, on the 2nd of August, Charles X abdicated in favour of his son, Marie's husband, Louis Antoine. Yet, Louis's prospects of quelling the discontent throughout France were no better than his father's, though it is believed that Marie urged him to assume the position of King of France. He hesitated at the idea, and 20 minutes after Charles X had abdicated, Louis Antoine in turn relinquished his rights to the throne in favour of his younger brother Henri, a 9-year-old who he hoped would become a consensus candidate to become the new monarch. The upshot of these developments on the 2nd of August 1830 was that for 20 minutes between Charles X's abdication and Louis Antoine's unrenunciation of the crown, Louis theoretically ruled as King Louis XIX of France. During those same 20 minutes, Marie-Thérèse, the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, was also briefly the Queen of France. The eventual resolution of the succession crisis came a week later on the 9th of August. The French Chamber of Deputies, or Parliament, decided that the young Henri was an unacceptable candidate and instead offered the throne to Louis Philippe, a member of the House of Bourbon, but one whose father, Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, had supported the French Revolution. As such, Louis Philippe had the benefit of being both a prince of royal blood, but one with good republican credentials. He accepted the throne on the 9th of August 1830 and would remain as Louis Philippe I for 18 years, in what would subsequently come to be called the July monarchy, after the revolt in 1830 which brought him to power. Following her brief stint as Queen of France and the accession of Louis Philippe I, Marie-Thérèse and her extended family, including her husband and the deposed Charles X, went into exile, fearing violence if they remained in France. On the 16th of August 1830, they departed from the port of Cherbourg for the United Kingdom, but they were received frostily in England itself, a country with a long history of conflict with the French monarchy. As a result, they quickly resettled further to the north in the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, where Marie and Louis had lived for some time after their marriage 30 years earlier. They would remain here for just over 2 years. Late in 1832, an invitation was extended to the exiled Bourbons by the Emperor Francis I of Austria to reside in the Central European Empire from which Marie's mother had originally hailed. Availing of this change in fortune, the former royal family took up residence at Prague Castle in Bohemia, but in 1835 relocated again to Gorizia. This is in Slovenia today, but was then part of Austria. Shortly after arriving on the Mediterranean coast, Marie's uncle Charles contracted cholera and died on the 6th of November 1836. Her last years were spent in relative obscurity by comparison with the misadventures and turmoil of her earlier life in the 1790s and 1820s. Her husband passed away in 1844, following which she relocated yet again to the outskirts of Vienna. Marie would live long enough to see a fresh rebellion sweep through France. This was part of a wider set of European popular uprisings in 1848, calling for liberalisation of the continent's governments. In France, this manifested itself in the deposition of Louis Philippe and the promulgation of the Second French Republic. It would prove short-lived, and in 1852, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a nephew of the great general who had conquered most of Europe 40 years earlier, proclaimed himself as head of the Second French Empire. However, Marie predeceased the ascension of Napoleon III as emperor in 1852 by several weeks. On the 19th of October 1851, she died of pneumonia at the age of 72. A regular exile from France throughout her life, It is perhaps fitting that she is buried in Gorizia with her uncle and husband. Her gravestone bears the inscription, Queen Dowager of France, in remembrance of the fact that the eldest child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette briefly ruled as Queen of France herself for just 20 minutes in 1830. Now let's look more in depth at what happened to her adopted children.
Marie Philippine Lambriquet was born in Versailles on the 31st of July, 1778. She was named after her mother, who became a maid to King Louis XVI's daughter, Madame Royale, and her father Jacques was a valet to Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister. She had two sisters who died in infancy, and one younger brother, Auguste, whose fate remains unknown. As a child, her days would have been filled with helping her parents, looking after her brother, keeping the house, and playing with the children of the town of Versailles. It is most likely that she grew up in the Grande Commune, Versailles' designated servant building, but she gained one remarkable friend. Somehow, she befriended Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, Madame Royale, the eldest child of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. These playmates got along so well that after her mother died, Marie Philippine was taken in by the Queen as a playmate. Madame Royale, or Charlotte, as she was known to those close to her, had been a proud and stubborn child, and Marie Antoinette hoped that, pairing her off with the maid's daughter, would teach her humility and make her aware of her privileges, and according to all accounts, it worked. 7 months after her mother died, Marie Philippine was officially adopted by the king and queen into the royal household, yet her brother Auguste was not. Also, while the king did award her with a pension of 12,000 livres, almost $100,000 in 2015, she was not given any titles, and the greater public never knew her as a daughter of France. There were multiple reasons for the adoption, including teaching Charlotte proper values, as well as solving Charlotte's loneliness, while she had no surviving sisters or female cousins. Marie Antoinette herself had been incredibly close to her sister Charlotte, after whom Charlotte was named, before they were forcefully separated, and it is possible that the Queen wanted the same for her daughter. Moreover, she had lost a baby girl the year before Ernestine's adoption, so in a way, she was replacing her lost daughter. Marie Antoinette officially renamed Marie Philippine Ernestine after her adoption, possibly after the main character from the 1765 book L'Histoire d'Ernestine by Marie-Jeanne Riccoboni. Ernestine wasn't the first child adopted by the king and queen. More than a decade earlier, the queen had almost run over a poor 5-year-old boy. The queen stopped her carriage just in time, and was so delighted with the boy that she adopted the orphan. He himself wasn't too excited about it, and he had to be forcefully removed from his grandmother, who knew the queen could give him and his siblings a better life. She gave money to his 2 sisters and employed his brother in the court orchestra. The boy, like Ernestine, was renamed from François Michel Gagné to Armand, after the Duchess of Polignac's son. Marie Antoinette probably adopted Armand because she herself had failed to have a child and was very unpopular for not birthing any heirs to France. In a few years, however, she would give birth to an heir, a son named Joseph, followed by another boy, Charles. This, along with his forced adoption, is what drove him to grow resentful of the monarchy and his adoptive parents. When the French Revolution hit, he ran away and joined the revolutionaries, betraying his adoptive parents. Other than Armand, Ernestine shared her life with her new adoptive siblings, Charlotte, Joseph and Charles. Charlotte and Ernestine looked so much alike that many foreign dignitaries thought they were twins. They spent every conceivable moment together. They shared a room, were treated the same by servants, and had the same education in languages, history, music, dancing, conversation, mathematics, and geography. Courtiers, on the other hand, didn't quite know how to treat Ernestine, who was not a princess or even a noble, but somehow lived as if she were. They usually called her Madame Royale's servant friend and treated her with caution. She was never included in official ceremonies, which would only feature the king and queen's biological children. Ernestine and Charlotte were educated by the governess, the Duchess of Polignac, who was later replaced by Madame de Tourzel. The sub-governess, who actually taught the girls on a day-to-day basis, were the elderly Angélique de Marcoux and her daughter Renée. While Angélique was a beloved grandmotherly figure to them, Renée was always known as a stern disciplinarian, and her subjects didn't like her much, though Renée would later prove to be a vital figure in Ernestine's life. During this time, the two girls loved spending time at their favourite place on the palace grounds, the Petit Trianon, the Queen's secluded little palace, and the adjoining Hameau de la Reine, a mock village where they would essentially learn about peasantry, albeit through a narrow and very optimistic view. Here Charlotte and Ernestine would have been taught to milk goats and cows, pick up eggs, pick flowers, among other things. Yet Ernestine's new family life wasn't all roses. Her adoptive brother Joseph, the Dauphin of France, who was the same age as her biological brother, suffered from ill health as he had tuberculosis. As a result, he had to wear metal corsets and often had to be driven around in a wheelchair. Unfortunately for the royal family, his condition continued to worsen, and this occurred at the worst of times. On the 5th of May 1789, the Estates General was summoned. This was an enormous meeting of dignitaries and representatives of the nobility, peasantry and clergy to discuss the king's unpopularity, the country's failing economy, the nationwide hunger, and the crown's malmanagement. Times were tense, to say the least. Because Joseph's health was deteriorating, the royal children were sent to the chateau of Meudon, where the air was clearer. Sadly, the little boy, the bright, clever Dauphin, died on the 4th of June 1789, aged 7, surrounded by doctors and his siblings, including Ernestine, who was very saddened by his death. Nevertheless, his parents were allowed no time to grieve. The king tried to postpone the Estates General, but the people were too angry to listen. "Are there no fathers among you?" he asked. "When my little Dauphin died, the world didn't seem to notice. The people have gone crazy since that day, and I can't stop crying," the Queen wrote to her brother. After the storming of the Bastille on the 14th of July, things started to change. More and more courtiers were leaving in a panic every day. The Duchess, the girl's head governess, was replaced by Madame de Tourzel. The king's brothers left, and around this time, Ernestine's father and brother left court as well. In October 1789, when Ernestine was 11, things would change for good. The women of Paris marched to the Palace of Versailles to claim bread for their hungry families. They broke in and killed the Queen's guards. The Queen herself narrowly escaped with her life through a secret passage, and she then quickly rushed to Charlotte and Ernestine's room to fetch them, as Madame de Tourzel got the Queen's son Charles, the new Dauphin. What followed was the scariest night of Ernestine's life. The entire royal family and their close friends huddled in the central room of the palace, in front of a crowd of hundreds eager to kill them. Ernestine would have heard the shots fired through the windows, hoping to hit someone. She would have also heard the vile insults the crowd shouted about the Queen. After the royal family had appeared on the balcony a few times, the crowd grew less violent. The king agreed to take his family to Paris, to the Tuileries, and they were now the people's prisoners. Ernestine and Charlotte would remain in Paris for the next 3 years, and during this time, Ernestine would grow more anxious about her uncertain position, as her life relied on the royal family, who no longer had control over their fates. While in Paris, Charlotte befriended Pauline de Torcel, Madame de Torcel's eldest daughter, who was 7 years older and wiser. And if that wasn't her replacement, the Queen decided to adopt another child while in captivity. When Marie Antoinette's usher died, leaving 3 daughters behind, she adopted the youngest one and put the 2 eldest in a boarding school, paying for their tuition. It is interesting to note that the Queen paid for these girls' education and still gave money and a position to Armand's siblings after his betrayal, yet never once took any notice of Ernestine's little brother. Perhaps Ernestine never mentioned him and feared that indulging him would mean indulging her less. The Queen's new adoptive daughter was named Zoe, after Madame de Torcel's youngest daughter, and served as a playmate to little Charles. In June 1791, when Ernestine was almost 13, the family tried to escape using their connections to other royal families, and to the Queen's former lover, Axel von Fersen. Several harsh decisions were taken to make this plan work. Little Charles was dressed as a girl, much to his distaste. Zoe was sent to her sisters, and Ernestine was dropped off with her father in Paris. If there was a place for Ernestine's story to end, it would have been here. Had the plan worked, she may have never seen Charlotte again. The plan was faulty, however. The Queen had been adamant in not separating herself and the king from their children, so an enormous, very unsubtle carriage had to be taken. The royal family's disguises were not very convincing, and too many people knew about the plan. The royal family was caught in Varennes when the local postmaster recognized King Louis's face from his money bill. Evidently, the escape attempt was met with great public disapproval, and when the carriage returned to Paris, it was almost trampled. The royals were now put under tight surveillance at the Tuileries Palace, but at least Ernestine and Charlotte were together again. Zoe, on the other hand, never came back, and it is unknown what became of her. In 1792, the Tuileries Palace was attacked twice. In June 1792, mobs invaded the palace and killed the Swiss guards. The Queen, her ladies and her children were cornered in a room with only a desk separating them from the vicious crowd. The mob demanded that Marie Antoinette wear the Republican tricolour, and her son the Dauphin as well. In another room, the king and his sister Elizabeth were cornered as well. Madame Elizabeth was actually injured by one of the invaders, who mistook her for the Queen. The king then delivered a speech that pacified the crowd for now, but this wouldn't last. Barely 2 months later, on the 10th of August, the Tuileries Palace was stormed again in a raid, and this time, those present weren't simply there to scare and insult the royal family. They were taking back power from the government and punishing the royals. This time, the Queen decided that it was too dangerous for Ernestine. The royal family were state prisoners, but Ernestine wasn't a royal, and moreover, she was virtually unknown. Ernestine had to say goodbye to Charlotte, and René of all people saved her. René took her to the main square before the Tuileries, where all hell had broken loose. Servants were killed, as well as guards and nobles. Invaders threw people out of the palace windows, and Ernestine saw all of this. She was scared for her life, and even if she survived, what would her life be like without Charlotte and her family? Then, René left Ernestine alone for a minute to fetch her carriage when some townspeople noticed her. They thought she was Madame Royale, because they looked so much alike, and proceeded to throw a dead body of a soldier at her, which pinned her to the ground. A shopkeeper, also believing her to be Madame Royale, defended her and freed her from the dead body trap, just in time as René's carriage arrived. Luckily, René and Ernestine managed to escape, but most of the courtiers were caught and put in prisons around Paris. René's mother, Angélique, was eventually freed after she swore allegiance to the Republic, but others, like the Princess de Lamballe, were slaughtered. Following the chaos of the 10th of August, René and her mother escaped to their country estate. Now, there is a bit of ambiguity over where Ernestine was during this time, as she was simultaneously registered at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, but when her father was beheaded for his loyalty to the king, on official papers, he said that his daughter was still living at home. It is most likely, however, that after August 1792, Ernestine lived with the René family, as the Queen had ordered. This would also be the safest option, given how dangerous Paris was. In the 3 years that followed, the King was beheaded, followed by his sister and the Queen. Little Charles, or Louis XVII, as he was called by the Royalists, died at the age of 10 after torturous treatment in the Tour du Temple prison. Charlotte was the only family member to survive. Well, she and Ernestine. In 1795, it was stated that Madame Royale would be released in a prisoner's exchange with Austria, her mother's homeland. To accompany her on her journey to Vienna, René was selected, being her former governess. The Austrian minister also asked if Ernestine could accompany Charlotte as well, to reunite them. René replied, however, that Ernestine could not be located, despite Ernestine living with her and her relatives. On the eve of her 17th birthday, Madame Royale was freed from the temple prison and accompanied by René, 2 guards, 2 servants, and 2 others, who raised a few eyebrows. A maid, Catherine de Varenne, and a boy named Pierre de Saucy, supposedly René's son. Yet, René had no son called Pierre, and Catherine can't be found anywhere but in the carriage's passports. Her last name is also suspicious, because it refers to Varennes, where the royal family was captured. Furthermore, Madame Royale was exchanged for the Varennes postmaster, who had recognized the king and stopped their escape attempt. It is theorized that Ernestine may have secretly joined the group as either or both of these people. One can only wonder what it must have been like for Charlotte to see the man who had squashed her family's chances of survival. If Ernestine was present on this journey, she would have encountered another old friend from Versailles, because Charlotte was given Coco, her family's old dog, who had survived the revolution as well. In 1796, Ernestine went to a lawyer's office in Paris and was declared legally of age. She was now independent and in charge of her own finances, including her pension from the late king. She stayed around in Paris and married the proprietor Jean-Charles Germain Prompin, who was a widower and father of 3. Ernestine married him in 1810, aged 32, relatively late for her time. It is unknown what Ernestine did to support herself for the 14 years between her declaration of age and her marriage. Ernestine died on New Year's Eve in 1813, at the age of 35. She died near Saint-Denis, where her adoptive brother Joseph had been buried. After the restoration of the House of Bourbon in 1814, Charlotte sent out investigations for what had happened to her adoptive sister, only to find out that she had died.
Although not her children, these next 2 stories are of her closest friends, both of whom were like family to Marie Antoinette, and like her, had tragic fates.
The woman who would one day rise to a position of major prominence at the French court was born as Yolande Martine Gabrielle de Polastron in Paris on the 8th of September 1749. She was born into a family with an ancient aristocratic pedigree, but one which had fallen on hard times during the 18th century, the result of debts accumulated over several generations. Gabrielle, as she was commonly known, spent her childhood on a family estate in the Languedoc region in the far south of France. When she was just 3 years of age, her mother died, at which time Gabrielle was entrusted into the care of an aunt, Madame Dandelot. Her education was received at a local convent, and it was possibly owing to this austere upbringing that she eschewed the trappings of the French nobility at the time, such as decadent clothing and plentiful jewellery. This was in sharp contrast to the environment which she would find herself living in during the 1770s and 1780s. When she was just 16 years of age, Gabrielle was promised in marriage to Jules François Armand, Comte de Polignac, who was 3 years her senior. The Polignacs were, like the Polastrons, an ancient aristocratic French family, but one which had fallen on hard times in the course of the 18th century. The couple were married on the 7th of July, 1767, when Gabrielle was 18 and Jules was 21. He was a commissioned officer in the French army, and they might have expected to lead a moderately comfortable life going forward, had things continued as they were going for him. But in 1775, a fateful meeting would change the course of their lives forever. In 1775, Gabrielle and her husband were invited to the French royal court at Versailles, outside Paris, through the intervention of Gabrielle's sister-in-law, Diane de Polignac, a lady-in-waiting there to the Countess of Artois, the sister-in-law of the French king. In the mid-1770s, the French court was centred around a new royal couple. On the 10th of May 1774, a new king had ascended to the throne, the 19-year-old Louis XVI. His consort was Queen Marie Antoinette, Louis's wife since 1770, and 18 years old herself at the time of the ascension in 1774. Marie was also a member of the Austrian royal family of the Habsburgs, and the brother of the current ruler of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II. The new king and queen ruled over one of the most autocratic states in Europe. Louis exercised enormous power as the French king, and the country was governed by a small group of bureaucrats from Versailles in association with the French nobility. The French parliament had not met since the early 17th century, and there was little or no consultation with the wider population in framing government policy in France. When they were presented before the king and queen at Versailles in 1775, Queen Marie instantly took a liking to Gabrielle. The fairly impoverished young woman and her husband, especially when considering their social class, were quickly invited to relocate to the court at Versailles, an opportunity which they gladly accepted when the Queen offered to settle their outstanding debts and put them on a more secure financial footing. The months that followed saw Gabrielle and Jules rise rapidly at the French court. She quickly became the Queen's closest confidant, Marie Antoinette, seeming to view Gabrielle as a surrogate older sister, a psychological crutch of sorts for a young woman who had left her blood family behind in Vienna when she was relocated to France several years earlier. Gabrielle and Jules had 2 children, Exile, born in 1768, and Armand, born in 1771, when they first arrived at Versailles. In the years that followed, 2 further children, Jules and Camille, were born in 1780 and 1781. The family became an omnipresent feature of court life at Versailles, constantly in the close circles of the king and queen. Indeed, when the governess of Marie and Louis's own children resigned in 1782, the queen asked Gabrielle to take over the position of governess of the royal children. This, along with the granting of the title of Duke and Duchess of Polignac in 1780, is a clear indication of how high Gabrielle and Jules' standing had risen at the French royal court. Yet, life at Versailles was not entirely without its difficulties. The couple's marriage, while relatively content, was hardly a committed one, and both Gabrielle and Jules are rumoured to have engaged in extramarital affairs. Gabrielle, reputedly having been involved in a long tryst with the captain of the Royal Guards, Joseph Hyacinthe, Comte de Vaudreuil, during the 1780s. More worrying was a development during the mid-1780s, when Gabrielle and the Queen's relationship temporarily became quite frosty, for a variety of reasons relating to the court politics of Versailles. What had become known as the Salon Polignac, Gabrielle's circle of court favourites, was deemed to have become too powerful a feature at Versailles in the mid-1780s, and the Queen seems to have started to give a greater hearing to other courtiers who sought to reduce Gabrielle's influence and power. Thus, in an effort to allay the royal disfavour, Gabrielle took a temporary vacation from the court, visiting aristocratic friends in England. Absence seems to have made the heart grow stronger in this instance, and when the Polignacs returned to France in 1786, Gabrielle soon found herself back in the good graces of Queen Marie Antoinette. New honours were afforded to them, and fresh money found its way to the Polignacs. Yet, while Gabrielle and her husband were once again prospering at Versailles, away from the insulated world of the French court, some 15 kilometres to the northeast, in Paris, the Polignacs were perceived in a decidedly different fashion. As economic difficulties, harvest failures, and political disillusion swept the French capital in the 1780s, the aloof French court at Versailles became a subject of intense criticism amongst Parisians. In particular, the Polignacs were a target of cruel attacks. Criticism focused on the alleged extravagance of the Queen's favourite in her spending at court, at a time when the pretentious behaviour of the French aristocracy was arousing widespread anger throughout France. This criticism soon took on a lewd edge, as graphic pamphlets circulated in Paris depicting Gabrielle as a lesbian lover of the Queen. Hence, as the political situation was becoming more and more tense in France during the 1780s, the Polignacs were becoming a subject of particular criticism in Paris and wider afield. These tensions were all about to boil over, with enormous implications, not just for France, but the entire history of modern Europe. What has become known as the French Revolution was the result of years of poor leadership by Louis XVI and successive governments he appointed to run France. During the 1780s, numerous bad harvests in the country had driven up food prices, a development which was compounded by France's population having expanded from about 18 million people in 1700 to approximately 26 million in the 1780s. Overshadowing this was a massive financial crisis which had left the French government with an unprecedented 4.5 billion livres of debt. In an effort to stem the crisis, Louis XVI had appointed a series of new finance ministers in the 1880s, including Jacques Necker and Charles de Calonne. None of these could solve the situation though, and there were increasing calls to summon the French Parliament in order to have a financial subsidy given by Parliament to the King in order to solve the financial crisis. The Polignacs played their own slightly significant role in these affairs. Gabrielle was a strong supporter of the absolutist, monarchical position at court. This view argued that the King and Queen should not bend to public discontent and should prioritise the power of the monarchy above the pressures of solving the crises which were unfolding. Ultimately, however, Louis would capitulate to the need for financial aid from the French political community. In May 1789, he took the drastic step of summoning the French Parliament, known as the Estates General. This was the first time a parliament had been summoned in France since 1614. Louis's goal was to have the parliament vote him a large financial subsidy which could be used to tackle the economic crisis. In return, he would be pressed to grant political concessions to the wider French political community. The challenge for the king and his advisors would be to acquire the money needed, while making as few concessions as possible. Yet, The plan failed in a spectacular fashion. Within weeks, power began to slip out of the hands of the French monarch and into those of radical revolutionaries within the parliament, who in June 1789 declared that the Estates General was now a national assembly. The political community of Paris became increasingly violent in the summer months, culminating on the 14th of July 1789, when the crowds in Paris stormed the royal prisons there, known as the Bastille Saint-Antoine. The French Revolution would escalate further in the months ahead, with the king and queen effectively placed under arrest by the new revolutionary government. However, while Louis and Marie were detained in France, despite an effort to flee in 1791, the storming of Bastille in July 1789 was the spark which led the Polignacs to depart from the country. Gabrielle and her family initially left for Switzerland. There is plenty of surviving correspondence from her to Marie Antoinette in the months that followed, to be able to trace the family's movement, and also the fact that she kept in contact with the Queen. It is clear that Gabrielle was also suffering from a severe illness at this time. At some point in the 1780s, the Queen's favourite had developed cancer, and by the time they were living in Switzerland, she was suffering considerably already from her illness. Despite her poor health, the family continued to move regularly in the early 1790s. After their sojourn in the Alpine state, the Polignacs travelled south to Italy, where they visited Turin, Rome, Venice, and several other major towns and cities. Their ultimate destination, though, was Austria. By 1791, they were in Vienna, where the Polignacs presumably received a very cordial reception from Marie Antoinette's wider Habsburg family. Their journey to Vienna was surely owing to a belief that if Marie and Louis were released by the revolutionary government in France, they would travel themselves to the Queen's homeland. But this would never occur. In France, Louis had tried to have Europe's other powers intervene to restore the monarchy against the revolutionary government. Eventually, the absolute monarchy was abolished late in 1792 as a result of these actions. Louis was found guilty of high treason and executed by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. Marie's own trial commenced the following October. Just 2 days later, she was convicted and executed herself on the 16th of October 1793 in Paris. Gabrielle's own death followed just weeks later, but under very different circumstances. She died on the 9th of December 1793 in Vienna, almost certainly owing to the cancer she had been suffering from for some time, though her family at the time claimed she had died owing to her heartbreak at the news of Marie Antoinette's execution. Gabrielle's life has become a focus of myths and legends about the French court at Versailles on the eve of the French Revolution. There is little doubting that the court at this time was highly responsible in its grandiose behaviour, during a period when the common people of France were suffering from harvest failures and financial crisis. But while the Polignacs became a focus of criticism within political circles in Paris in the 1780s as a result, there is little substantial evidence to suggest that Gabrielle was any more immoral in her conduct than any of her contemporaries at Versailles. As such, our view of her as the epitome of the incompetent behaviour of the French aristocracy at the end of the Ancien Regime is somewhat unfair. Yolande Martine Gabrielle de Polastron, Duchess of Polignac, was a product of the court culture of early modern France and a wholly typical example of that same culture. The princess was born Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy-Carignano in Turin, Italy, on the 8th of September 1749. She was the daughter of Louis Victor of Carignano and Landgravine Christine of Hesse-Rheinfeld-Rothenburg, both of whom were descended from European royalty. She was said to have a pretty head with luxuriant blonde hair that once broke free of its bands, flowed down to her feet. The princess came from an extremely wealthy family and was well educated. She spoke several languages and was well read. She loved reading Italian poetry as well as books by popular authors, such as Machiavelli and Dante. Reading was one of her favourite pastimes, and she had invested in her own extensive personal library. Her impressive education and the wealth of her family put her in good standing for marriage. In 1767, the Duke of Penthièvre had asked Louis XV to help him in finding a suitable wife for his son, the Prince de Lamballe. The king agreed and suggested he turn his attention to the Princess of Savoy. The Prince de Lamballe was shown a portrait of the princess, and at just the age of 17, her fate was sealed. She arrived in France on the 30th of January at Montereau and was greeted by an inquisitive-looking young man with a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Initially confused, the princess soon realized that this was her future husband. They were married later on that same day in the chapel of the Château de Nangis, in the home of the Count of Guerchy. The marriage, though, was short-lived. The Princess de Lamballe had shown her husband love and affection, and initially, the two seemed happy in marriage, but the court of Versailles was notorious for its scandals, and it wasn't long before the princess found herself at the centre of another. The princess was introduced to the court of Versailles, where she had gained admirable favour, but the relationship between her and her husband quickly broke down. The prince had engaged in an adulterous relationship with two actresses, and Marie was left devastated by her husband's betrayal. Her father-in-law consoled her, but after a year of marriage, she would be hit with even more grief as her husband passed away in 1768 of a venereal disease, before he could reach the age of 21. She had managed to find forgiveness for her husband's transgressions, caring for him tenderly until he passed away. The princess went on to begin her new life, moving in permanently to reside at Rambouillet, near Versailles, where her father-in-law was seated as the Duke of Penthièvre. The Duke had taken to the princess and regarded her as his own daughter. He recommended that she take a vow of chastity and become a nun. Though never a nun, she chose to remain faithful to her husband throughout her life. After inheriting her husband's wealth, she joined her father-in-law in completing his many charitable works. The Duke became known as the King of the Poor, and Marie de Lamballe earned the nickname the Angel of Penthièvre. She eventually recovered from her grief, although still injured by a series of melancholic moments, which would gradually get worse with age. In 1770, the Dauphin Louis married Marie Antoinette, the daughter of Maria Therese, the Empress of Austria. Louis ascended to the throne just 4 years later, in 1774, becoming King Louis XVI. After living in the court for some time, the relationship between Marie Antoinette and the Princess de Lamballe began to blossom. Marie Antoinette had found her new confidant in the princess, and the following year, in 1775, she was also proclaimed as superintendent of the Queen's household. The Princess de Lamballe accompanied the Queen on many of her excursions and to many of her parties. The Duke of Penthièvre succumbed to the lifestyle of the King and Queen, and even began to express his interest in hosting international royalty. He went on to host the Crown Prince of Sweden and the King of Denmark, with the Princess de Lamballe acting as his hostess. The court of Versailles was home to many balls and parties, becoming notorious for their lavish lifestyle and lust for all things extravagant. After all, Louis XIV had almost bankrupted the entire state when he drafted the renowned French landscape architect André Le Nôtre to redesign the 2,000 acres of Versailles. Due to France's monetary situation, King Louis XVI hired Anne Robert Jacques Turgot to get a hold of the nation's financial state. Turgot was on a mission to provide the common populace with financial liberty and wealth. He wrote a letter to King Louis stating that he wanted no bankruptcy, no increase of taxes, and no borrowings. Turgot himself was pro-monarchy, as long as the monarchy worked on behalf of the people. With his new laws and regulations coming into effect, King Louis XVI had needed to bring the estates in Brittany into stricter compliance, as the region had previously operated as a somewhat autonomous state. In order to do this, the king needed a reliable diplomat to quell any backlash or anti-monarchist sentiments. And so, he called upon the Duke of Penthièvre as the perfect man for the job. The Princess de Lamballe accompanied him to Rennes on the 17th of December 1774. Their venture into the region was a huge success, and the princess herself had managed to win the hearts of the region's population. The Princess de Lamballe had been gone from the court at Versailles for 2 months, and the Queen Marie eagerly anticipated her return. Having gleefully learned that the princess was leaving a few days earlier than expected to return home, the Queen had requested that the princess head straight for Versailles. After the Princess de Lamballe entered Versailles, she was surprised to see that the Queen had ordered her portrait to be painted on a glass that had been placed in the room where the Queen spent most of her time. Yet, after spending a lot of her free time with the Queen, the princess's thoughts and interests began to wander. The Parisians loved all things supernatural. Their inclination to the superstitious and paranormal began long before the princess was born, but the intrigue had continued to grow. The Count of Saint-Germain had captivated the population, claiming to have lived for centuries and to have met Jesus Christ himself. Baron du Popet de Sennevoix had introduced the study of animal magnetism. Eliphas Lévy was a distinguished sage, and Alexis Vincent Charles Berbequier de Terre-Neuve-du-Thym had risen to fame as a renowned demonologist. The Princess de Lamballe had also been captivated by the supernatural, even corresponding with the cartomancer Madame Lenormand, as well as the astrologist and fortune-teller Mrs. Williams, who was of Welsh ancestry. Though much of her private life remains a mystery, it's known that the princess became intrigued by Freemasonry. In 1777, she became a member of the Lodge de Candeur and became one of the country's most prestigious members. And in 1781, she took on the role of the Grand Mistress of the Mère Lodge d'Écossaise d'Adoption. In 1775, a mass revolt broke out. The country's harvest had yielded an incredibly low volume of grain, and the country quickly began to find itself in a food shortage, unable to feed the population. People began blaming the monarchy, claiming they had purposely held the reserves back for themselves, and the people began to riot. The country was descending into panic. Looters were out in force, and farmers were held to ransom by the looters, who were forced into selling their grain for a lot lower prices. Throughout April and May, the rioters caused chaos in what became known as the Flower War. Tragedy struck again for the princess when in 1778 she lost both of her parents. In the year 1785, the population of France became increasingly hostile toward the throne and the lavish lifestyle they were living, while much of France suffered in the cases of extreme poverty. The people had needed to find an excuse for every possible misfortune, and they found it in Marie Antoinette. She became a public hate figure. The years of 1786 to 1789 remained free of tragedy for the princess, and, in a letter written by Horace Walpole, it said that the princess went on a visit to England in mid-1787. The situation in France, however, wasn't improving. The king became fonder of his personal collections, rather than making decisions on running the country, and the queen was more suited to spending large amounts of money on diamonds and other luxurious goods, as well as owing a lot of money in unpaid gambling debts. On the 5th of May 1789, King Louis XVI assembled the Estates General at Versailles, which hadn't met since 1614. He called the meeting to introduce a new tax law, which would impose a higher tax rate on landowners and wealthy noblemen. The middle class at the meeting, which included the likes of lawyers and teachers, had called for a constitution. The king was outraged. He believed the monarchy should maintain absolute power, with no set of rules or government to take away his power. Those in attendance at the estate's general meeting had formed an oath at the nearby tennis court on the 20th of June 1789, in which they declared they would not go home until the king agreed to form a constitution. On the 27th of June, they formed their own parliament, which they called the National Assembly. Some nobles and clergymen also began joining the new parliament. The king was angered, but so too were the common people. Bread prices were still high, and many were still going hungry. The king refused to accept the National Assembly and even sacked a minister who was known to be working on behalf of the poor. Completely outraged, thousands of residents gathered in protest and stormed the fortress of Bastille. Against the estimated 8,000 protesters, the king's men did nothing to stop the storming of the fortress. The governor of Bastille handed over the keys to the protesters, but it was too late to be sympathetic toward them now. He was a man that had helped to lock up hundreds of prisoners that had spoken out against the king. The protesters had their man, and in a rage, proceeded to behead the governor. This was the first time the peasants of France had revolted against the absolute power of the king, and won. Spurred on by their victory, the protests were growing in ferocity, and Louis knew that he had lost Paris. Any thoughts of attempting to win back the Bastille by force were quickly shunned. Rumours began circling that King Louis was drawing up plans to use military force in order to get rid of the National Assembly. In October, the royal family were taken to the palace at Tuileries, where the people could keep an eye on the king's actions. Still as defiant as ever, the king and the royal family tried to make their escape from France. The plan was to reach Austria and get help from Marie Antoinette's brother, who was now the Emperor of Austria. In June 1791, they made their attempt, but were stopped at Varennes and brought back to Paris in their carriage. In 1791, the Princess de Lamballe had managed to avoid capture and travelled to England once again, on a visit to Blenheim, Oxford and Bath. Only this time, it appears as though she was on a quest for protection. Marie Antoinette had already sent messages to ask for assistance, but it seems as though the princess arrived in person to ensure the severity of the impending situation was heard. The Queen of England received the princess with great affection and to great pleasure, but when she asked King George III for assistance, he refused, telling her that the French royal family had brought about their own misfortunes. The King of France wrote to the princess, telling her not to return, as things had gotten too dreadful. She wrote back saying, "The Queen needs me, and I must live or die at her side." She wrote her will at Aix-la-Chapelle, which even included her beloved dogs, and she returned to France to stand by the Queen's side. The National Assembly had some royalist sympathisers within its members, and Marie Antoinette held secretive meetings with them at Versailles when the family had been taken back to Paris. The Princess de Lamballe, known to be the Queen's confidant, was also suspected by the people of engaging sympathetically with the Austrians. On August 10, 1792, the monarchy was officially overthrown, and the princess was imprisoned in the Temple prison alongside Marie Antoinette. She was then transferred to La Force prison on August 19th. The princess was ordered to take an oath that denounced the monarchy and her best friend as the Queen of France, but she refused. On September 3rd, she met her brutal punishment. She was dragged outside the prison after a short trial and was struck numerous times with weapons wielded by the angry mob that awaited her. She fell to her knees after being struck in the head and eye. Her blood gushed over her dress. She was then hit with force over the head, which knocked her unconscious, and the mob then stripped her body and set about mutilating her until she was no longer recognizable. After these horrific and tragic scenes, her head was cut off and stuck on a pike, which the mob then paraded in front of Marie Antoinette's cell. Her charitable and kind works had accounted for nothing. She was a friend to the monarchy, and she wasn't to be treated any differently. At the time of her death, she was 42 years old.
Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Marie Antoinette's children and her best friends. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the lives down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. If you're new to the channel, it'd mean a lot if you'd subscribe, and I hope you guys have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.